There are certain things we can only see after extensive practice. So, for example, for me, this particular coin looks the same as any other old coin, but to a coin expert, this coin would would seem to them to be, say, an Augustan denarius. Similarly, to me, this is just any old sort of ring. You have to pretend now that this is a precious ring, but to an expert, this would be, say, a rhodolite garnet. And the question is whether these kinds of seemings confer prima facie justification. So that's what I'll be focusing on. Now, usually, all these different kinds of seemings are put together in the literature. People don't make a distinction between, say, the seemings of philosophers who have intuitions, or of mathematicians, or perceptual seemings, or even moral seemings. They're all put together. But in this paper, I will argue that skilled and ordinary seemings differ from each other, and that this differs in cognitive structure, and this difference matters for their justification. So roughly, for S to have a skilled seeming that P is for S to have an experience that P is true as a result of her expertise gained in a given domain. Now, there is an extensive literature about phenomenal conservatism, which basically holds that S is seeming that P provides S with the feasible, non-inferential justification for believing that P. There's no unified definition about what seemings might be. So some people have argued that seemings might be a kind of belief, which is evidenced by such linguistic expressions as, it seems to me like it's going to rain, but there are counterexamples. So something can seem to you a certain way without you believing it. So, for example, you can have a seeming of a certain optical illusion, say the Muller-Lyer illusion. Even though you believe that those lines are the same length, they will still appear to you or seem to you different lengths. So that's why many philosophers working in this literature have the idea that seemings are a kind of sui generis experience with a distinctive phenomenology. And so they give a certain feeling that a proposition is true, which Humer characterizes as forcefulness, and Tucker calls it assertiveness. Now, phenomenal conservatism doesn't discriminate between different types of seemings, and that is, in a sense, attractive about it, that it can seemingly disparate. So many disparate phenomena can be put together. However, I will argue that skilled and ordinary seemings differ from each other, and that this difference matters for their justification. So, roughly speaking, ordinary seemings are the result of other seemings you have as a result of stable developmental processes and minimal cultural input. An ordinary sense perception is a sort of standard example, but there's other examples, say linguistic intuitions in your first language. So this sort of thing comes about very naturally, can be disrupted, but requires unusual circumstances to be disrupted. So, for example, you can have, say, cats that are raised in environments with only vertical stripes. They will experience the environment in an atypical way. But basically speaking, this is cross-culturally widespread and stable. Skilled seemings only arise in specialists after a process of teaching and deliberate practice. So, for example, art connoisseurs can have all sorts of seemings about how a certain artwork appears to them that ordinary untrained participants will not have. So, how does the justification of these two types of seemings differ? So I think there are three different ways in which they differ. First, cognitive penetrability. Now, ordinary seemings tend to be cognitively impenetrable. There's a long-standing literature about this. But basically speaking, optical illusions, for example, indicate that your beliefs, that your mental states don't influence, that you can't influence the outputs of these things. So take, for example, the strawberry illusion, a recent illusion of strawberries on a plate. The strawberries look red, but there are actually no red pixels involved. It's just a matter of the way that your brain balances out color constancy. Skilled seemings, on the other hand, are cognitively penetrable. Not only are they sensitive to goals and beliefs, but you have some degree of control over them. Cognitive scientists used to think that the outputs of what experts did were purely automatic, like routines, but in fact, experts have quite some control over them. And this has been demonstrated in several experiments. For example, visual expertise of cars, birds, and other such things that look very similar. There is a long-standing literature discussion about whether the fusiform face area just attends to faces or whether it attends to a wide variety of categories of expertise, of visual expertise, and whether it just attends to faces as one instance. It turns out that even though car experts looking at cars and bird experts looking at birds have activation in the fusiform face area, that additionally there's a whole bunch of mechanisms involved with top-down control. So, for example, if you ask the car experts to only attend to cars and not to planes, or only to planes and not to cars, then you see that there is a dramatic increase or decrease in those areas that are relevant for visual expertise, depending on whether that task is relevant or not. And you just don't see that with ordinary seemings. So it seems that with skilled seemings, people have a lot more control over it, over their expertise. Not so much that it is controlled all the way down, but at the onset of the task, they will sort of tune what they have to pay attention to, and then these sort of automatic processes are at work. So take, for example, I bring this beautiful ring to a jeweler, and I tell the jeweler, this ring is my grandmother's and it's a heirloom, it's been in our family for generations. Or I bring the same ring and I say, I bought this on a flea market 2 weeks ago. Then the jeweler is going to use very different sorts of heuristics, and it's going to appear to her in a different way because she will focus her attention selectively depending on the background information. So this gives, at this point, you have a skeptical worry in that skilled seemings seem to be more vulnerable to prior belief states than ordinary seemings are. And that sort of casts doubt on the question of whether you can use phenomenal conservatism style justification for them. So take a recent experiment in which wine experts were given wine that was either a white wine, a red wine, or it was white wine that was artificially colored by devious experimenters to look red. It turned out that the wine experts actually perceived the wine differently when they thought it was red. They used words to describe the aroma of wine that's normally associated only with red wine, such as red currant, prune, and chocolate, when describing the white wine that was colored red. So if you take phenomenal conservatism style justification, if it seems to me that P, I have some defeasible justification for my belief that P, the problem is here that experience and belief aren't independent. It seems to be that they are very closely connected. And that makes it more difficult to have the sort of this kind of justification for skilled seemings. So the second way in which I think that skilled and ordinary seemings are quite different from each other is in their metaphysical structure. So in a series of recent papers, Susanna Schellenberg has argued that perceptual seemings provide justification due to their metaphysical structure. So what she says is that if you have a bad case of perception, such as illusions and hallucinations, they are bad cases of perception, but they're parasitic on good cases of perception. So, for example, suppose that I see a cup in front of me. It might well be that I hallucinate the cup, but even so, my hallucination is going to be dependent on me actually seeing the cup, and my perceptual system is there, and it's picking out things in the environment, and that's what the bad cases are going to be dependent upon. So in that respect, the hallucination is some form of evidence, although it's not as good evidence as veridical perception. So if a subject S is perceptually engaged with her environment, she is in a sensory state that provides phenomenal evidence. However, with skilled seemings, we just don't know if there are good cases on which bad cases are parasitic. So there are several instances where people aren't perceiving anything. There's never any good case. Take aura reading. So aura readers, they purport to see your mood and other mental states on the basis of the aura around your body or your head. Now there have been empirical studies trying to do this behind screens and so on, and there's actually nothing being perceived there. So I think given that skilled seemings are dependent on these social practices, that this metaphysical argument, this phenomenal evidence argument, works for ordinary seemings but does not work for skilled seemings. So this raises a circularity worry. The circularity worry is that supposing that a coin like this is indistinguishable for me from coins that look very similar, but Roman coin experts can tell the difference. Given that we can't go back to ancient Rome, the only way we're going to know about whether these coins are different or the same is the say-so of these experts and their seemings. And there's a worry because the only way in which they know is that they have this practice of engaging with these objects. If you ask an art connoisseur, how do you know this is a Rembrandt? Well, they can explicate that, but often they will say something like, it just seems to me that way. And this gives rise to circularity worry, which Keetje talked about when he discussed scientific practice. So he says, you have many scientific practices which are dependent on seemings, like, for example, primatology. A primatologist will look at baboons and she will see dominance relationships, and it will seem to her that a subdominant monkey is trying to run away from a dominant monkey, whereas a novice will just see a jumble of monkeys. And the only way in which the novice can learn to actually see all sorts of things into that is through experience, through selectively attending to the material. Now, the pessimistic conclusion that you might reach is that the skills aren't skills at all. The interpretation could be viciously circular. And I think there is real concern for this. If you look at art connoisseurs, for example, there was this forger called Han van Meegeren, and he made a bunch of fake Vermeers and he passed them off as real Vermeers. And because there was a really influential art connoisseur, Bredius, who was very, very positive about these paintings, that all the art world was into them and was saying, for instance, about the Christ and the Emmaus, that it was beautiful, that the colors were vibrant and balanced and, subtle and so on. But then once it was revealed that it was in fact a fake, then they said the colors were just dull and insipid. So it's even at a perceptual level, it struck them differently depending on what background information they had. So given that that's the case, I think for skilled seemings, you would need some sort of independent information about what a practice is before you can actually accord any sort of justificatory power to individual seemings. So there are some reasons to be optimistic about seemings in a skilled context. Namely, I think in a sense that The risk of deception is quite minimal. So given that there is a social transmission going on with skilled seemings, there is the worry about that you could have been taught by people who didn't really know their stuff. But this is actually really difficult given the amount of time that you need being trained. And it's very, very difficult to be a fraud in that respect. So Kim Strelny gives this example about how difficult it would be for him to pretend to be an Australian birder. He'd have to invest quite some time and energy into getting equipment and field guides and so on to at least give that impression. Whereas, of course, he did put all that effort in, but now it's quite easy for him to actually show that he is an Australian birder because he is one. So with knowing how, it's just very difficult to show what you're doing without actually having the requisite skills. There is also the fact that these skilled seemings are part of a broader skill set, and that can give some justification to what people are doing. So, for example, chess seemings are important for being a successful chess player. Or, in the case of the ring, the jeweler needs to at least be able to make some educated guesses about what the materials are that she gets before she starts investigating them with all sorts of specialized equipment, because after all, her livelihood depends on it. So to conclude, skilled seemings cannot confer justification in the same way as ordinary seemings do. We need to consider them as a result of a social practice. We can't use phenomenal conservatism style arguments to argue that they in fact do provide justification.